As Jesus came out of the temple, one of his disciples said to him, "Look, teacher, what large stones, what large buildings." Then Jesus asked him, "Do you see these great buildings? Not one stone will be left here upon another. All will be thrown down." When he was sitting on the Mount of Olives opposite the temple, Peter, James, John, and Andrew asked him privately, "Tell us, when will this be? And what will be the sign all these things are about to be accomplished?" Then Jesus began to say to them, "Beware that no one leads you astray. Many will come in my name and say, 'I am he,' and they will lead many astray. When you hear of wars and rumors of wars, do not be alarmed. This must take place, but the end is still to come. For nation will rise against nation and kingdom against kingdom. There will be earthquakes in various places. There will be famines. This is but the beginnings of the birth pangs." This is the word of the Lord. The New Testament was written to help a community of people thrive through collapse. The New Testament was written to small communities, groups of people living around the ancient Near East and the Mediterranean, in what we would call modern-day Israel, Palestine, Syria, Turkey, Macedonia, Greece. In these areas, there were all of these small communities, many of them not even yet calling themselves Christians, just followers of the way, still understanding themselves to be part of the larger family of the Jewish people. These small communities knew that they were living in times of turmoil and oppression. They knew that they were living in times of danger, and that the empire was an unstable and violent place for them in particular. And they needed a reason, they needed a method, they needed a hope that would guide them through the turbulent times they were living in, and the New Testament was written to them to offer them that support. The Gospel of Mark, in particular, was written immediately after the fall of the temple in Jerusalem in 70 AD, when the Roman army, when the Roman Empire came in and sacked the city of Jerusalem, burned the temple to the ground, knocked all the stones off of the one off the other, looted all the gold out of the temple, and left the people of Israel, who had worshipped there for hundreds of years without a center or place of worship any longer, completely destroying a way of life that had been in place for generation upon generation. It was an apocalypse, it was an end times, it was a total destruction of a way of life and a community and a people and a history. It was traumatic and awful for those who were living through that time, and they needed something to help them get through that time. They needed something that would convince them that there was a hope at the end of this experience for them. And therefore, in the Gospel of Mark, we have Jesus not only aware that the temple is corrupt and that the temple needs correcting, but predicting that the temple will be destroyed, telling his followers in advance that this would be so, and to prepare themselves for this experience and how to get through it. In other words, the people for whom our Bible was intended were living through a total collapse of their social systems, and their faith was designed and intended to help them with that. And that makes it particularly relevant and useful for our times. Because, friends, whether or not you have heard it phrased to you in this way or not yet, the truth is that we are also living through a collapse of our social systems. We are also living through a turbulent end times, by which I do not mean, a supernatural end times. I do not mean that, that the skies are going to turn red with flame and boil with blood, and that Jesus is going to descend from the clouds in heaven and anything of that sort. I do not mean an image of the rapture that you may have heard of from some texts or other. This is not a particularly good representation of what our Bible says about endings. I mean simply that the social systems that we have thought of as permanent are proving to be rather temporary, and in fact are failing us in countless ways, are falling apart. They're falling apart around us. And so, similar to the people who were alive at the times that these texts were written, we also need messages of hope and comfort. We also need promises that will guide us through these periods of collapse. We also need to know how to thrive in the midst of a collapsing society. The reality of collapse is somewhat different than the imagination of collapse. Our culture has in fact been obsessed with collapse for decades now. If you look at our popular culture, you'll see television show after movie, after novel, after story, one right after another, all predicting some kind of terrible collapse, right? Like there's millions of stories like The Walking Dead, right, where the world falls apart, there's some sort of disaster apocalypse. We have, in fact, we call it post-apocalyptic literature or, storytelling. It's an entire genre of literature and storytelling. And even stories that aren't necessarily post-apocalyptic are almost all at least apocalyptic. If you go to see any Marvel movie, every single Marvel movie ends with something about to destroy the world, right? Like that's every single Marvel movie. There's something that's gonna just about destroy the world and the hero just stops it in time. We are obsessed with the idea that the world is gonna fall apart and that the world is going to end. For good reason, because I think this is our subconscious telling us that things are untenable, that things are unstable as they presently exist. But our imaginations portray this as something that is going to happen in one big fell swoop, like in the Marvel movies, right? It's one big giant bomb that's going to go off, or one big giant terrible thing's going to happen, and all of a sudden it's going to go from everything's fine to everything's terrible all at once, which isn't what actually happens in collapse. What actually happens in collapse is it takes years, decades, sometimes generations to really fully fall apart, and in the middle of that, people's lives go on, like effectively normal, like things continue, things happen. And I want to give you some examples of this kind of bizarre normality that is true in the middle of collapse. There was a story told to me by a woman who was a refugee from Sri Lanka. In the 80s and 90s, Sri Lanka's government fell apart. Sri Lanka's government fell into civil war, and thousands of people were killed, and there was a period of about 4 or 5 years where there was no government at all in Sri Lanka, and when a new government eventually emerged, it was entirely different than the previous. Who was in power before was gone, and who was in power now was totally different than before. Their whole society basically collapsed. This woman, during that period, her family escaped Sri Lanka and came to the United States as refugees. But she told a story about her experience of living there during the collapse. And the story was about her going to a nightclub to go dancing. And she talked about walking down the street to go to the nightclub and walking past like dead bodies that were there because of there was fighting, there was gunfire in the middle of the day. Some people got shot and they had been killed and they had been left there in the street to die. And she said, here's the thing about it. We just walked past them and went to the nightclub and went dancing and had a great time. And I look back at my phone and I have text messages that night of me talking to my friends about how excited we were and how drunk we were gonna get and how much fun it was at the club. What she wanted to emphasize was that we often don't even realize when we're in the middle of collapse because the signs of collapse are all around us, but life still somehow kind of goes on in the middle of it. It's not like everything stops. It's not like in the movies where everyone runs around screaming and panicking and everything falls apart all at once. Actually, most people just kind of go about their lives like normal. We've had this phrase in our culture to avoid something like the plague. We have this colloquialism, we avoid something like the plague, but one thing we've kind of learned through the past couple years of plague is that a lot of people don't actually spend that much effort trying to avoid the plague. A lot of people kind of go on with their lives like normal, even though there's a massive catastrophe that is affecting the entire planet. Millions of people have died in the past couple years, and well, for a lot of us, it's been kind of okay, right? Like things have more or less continued. Things have disrupted our lives in some ways, but also they've also become kind of normal. And the things that at first seemed like a huge imposition now just seem like what we're accustomed to, now just seem kind of acceptable, or at least we can tolerate it. collapse doesn't necessarily look like a big upheaval. It often looks like just sort of accepting a certain level of challenge and change that you grow accustomed to without realizing it. I have another friend who, she's from China. She immigrated here to America from China. And she did that 2 years ago, so just before COVID-19. She immigrated here and she came to Portland, and she said the whole first year that she was here, she could not believe how much poverty and houselessness there was. She walked down the street and she was just absolutely shocked, just constantly, and she found it weird because her friends would just ignore it. They would just go together to the restaurant or whatever, and they were standing in line to go to some place like Salt and Straw or something like that, and they would stand in the line and they would just walk right past these encampments of houseless people and not say a word, and she would be like, what's going on here? She's like, in China we don't have this. In China, there's no houselessness like this. If you're poor, you're given housing by your community. You're made sure that you have housing by your community. We can't even imagine the idea that we would let just thousands of people just sleep on our street and just act like that was normal. But we're all so accustomed to it, we probably don't even realize, can't even think of another solution. Our governments literally come to meetings. I was at a city council meeting 2 weeks ago, and at the city council meeting, the city council hearing was like, well, yeah, it's just a big problem. No one knows what to do. There's no solution. Like, the people with the power to do something are literally saying, you know, like, that's how accustomed to it we are. Most of us just sort of don't realize. But let me explain to you, that is a collapsing society. When you have thousands of people sleeping on the street, that is a society that is not functioning. That is a society that is falling apart. If we saw the same thing in historical representations of other time periods, we would think, oh, that was a terrible time period to live in. Obviously, that was a period when there was, great inhumanity and destruction and cruelty among people. But that's our time period right now. That's the time period and culture that we are living in. Collapse is something that can become extremely normalized because it's just happening kind of quietly in the background around us all the time. And it's something that we get accustomed to. So the first thing I want to say to you about collapse is to recognize that it's not going to be something that you wake up one morning and go, oh no, this is it. It's already here and it's kind of continuing, and it's just gonna kind of continue like that unless we do something to change it and to stop it. So you shouldn't expect the Marvel movie ending, right? Like, that day is never gonna come. It's just gonna continually be a situation of progressively things degrade and we don't even notice or realize it necessarily because it's happening slowly around us all the time. All right, I promised you that this New Testament was written to give people hope. Let's try and find some hope here, right? What does this say? What does the New Testament say to those people about how to get through this collapse? It doesn't just say that things will collapse. It says, how do they get through the collapse? And I started by trying to describe collapse to you because I just wanted you to sort of be able to see it, be able to recognize it around yourself there. But what it says is several things. First of all, to recognize the temporariness of the thing that is collapsing. Jesus here tells the disciples, they are so impressed with the size and strength of the temple, right? They're so impressed. Look how big these stones are. And Jesus says, no, not one of these stones is going to remain on top of another stone. His point here is for people to understand what is lasting and what is temporary. Many of the things that we are going to see collapse around us, institutions that we have grown accustomed to, that we expect to be there, are things that we have thought of as permanent, like the disciples thought of the temple. But in truth, they were always temporary there. So what is permanent? What does Jesus point to as something that you can build a faith on, build a community on? Jesus points to 4 things for us to get in touch with that outlast any collapse. Excuse me. There are 4 things that I would like you and your friends and all of us to try to learn to rely on that are more enduring and more supportive than social institutions and societies and things like that that are enduring. The first thing is the land itself. The land that we live on was here before we were here, and it will be here after we are no longer here. This land that God has made is not going anywhere. Humans may do a lot to alter it in the temporary and even somewhat in the long term, but we will never be able to outlast it or destroy it. It is far beyond our capacity to do so. This land is here and will stay here, and it will outlast the United States of America or any other government or institution or culture or ideology. The land will be here. And so, Jesus invites his disciples, and the New Testament continually calls them back to a relationship with the creation, to a relationship with land itself. So one thing we can do to thrive through collapse is to get in touch with our land. Put our hands actually in the dirt. Grow plants. Get to know the creatures that share this space with us. Get to know the waterways and the hills and the rocks and the forests and the wetlands. Get to understand the way that this place breathes and lives, independent of you, but also inclusive of you, right? Like, this place doesn't need you, but yet you are a part of it, and you can impact it and affect it, and you can make it better. You can enrich that soil by helping to make sure that nutrients aren't depleted from it, that are going back into it. You can help ensure that there's greater biodiversity and more creatures and more living and thriving things living in it. You can have a positive impact on this land around you, and in seeking to be in relationship with the land will sustain you. In fact, the land already is. Every single one of us is only alive because we eat food that the land has provided. All of us are sustained every single second, every single moment of our entire lives by the land that we live on, and therefore, it only makes sense for us to return that kind of care and attention back to the land. And being in touch with the land will help you make sense of things through a situation of collapse. Because the temple might not be permanent, but the mountain on which that temple is built sure is. The temple might be knocked down, but the rocks underneath the temple didn't go anywhere. The next thing that Christ invites us to be in touch with in order to survive and endure and thrive through a period of collapse is our own body. Christ invites his disciples to recognize their own flesh as a gift from God and to inhabit it. This is why so much of his ministry centers around eating, feasting, and being together with his disciples, right? They spend a lot of time just together eating food, breaking bread, and the central ritual and liturgy of our faith is around this idea that we break bread together, and Christ reminding us this bread is my body, which is, of course, a metaphorical statement about sacrifice and about community and unity and all those things, but it's also just a literal statement that the food we eat composes the cells of our body and that we are embodied beings. It's just an invitation to accept and welcome our embodiedness with one another. And so, toward that end, just as I said, to get your hands in the soil in order to get yourself in touch with the land, I invite you to get physically in touch with your body. Take deep breaths and feel that breath entering into your lungs and spreading through your whole system, nourishing every single cell from the tips of your fingers to the soles of your feet, to the scalp, to the top of your head. Every single part of you was made by God, designed by God, that you might live and thrive and be part of God's ecosystem. To get in touch with your body, spend time being aware of it. Be physically active in whatever way makes sense for your body, right? In whatever way makes sense for your body. That could be going on long walks and hiking, or it could be sitting in your chair and stretching out your toes and just feeling your flesh. It could be, being involved in some kind of sport to get to feel yourself sweat and your blood pump, or it could be, stretching out on your bed at night and just feeling the weight of your body against the mattress and the air of your room against your skin, and just being aware of the fact that you are flesh and blood. Your body will be with you your entire life. There is no point in time when you will be apart from your body, and that means that you and your body must get through whatever it is you have to get through together. You might as well be in good relationship with it. The third thing that the New Testament would invite us to be in touch with in order to thrive through a collapse is our community. And by our community, I mean something much more intimate and important than our society, than the world around us, right? I mean us. I mean the people sitting in the pews next to you and the people who are in your daily life with you, your family, your friends, your immediate neighbors around you, the people who you interact with on a personal, everyday kind of basis. These are the people which ultimately will help you make sense of whatever turmoil there is going on in the world, and will ultimately help you endure. And unfortunately, we have lived in a society and a world for too long that has tried to tell us that community is not really necessary, that we're all heroic individuals out by ourselves here trying to do our own thing, and we don't really need other people to do that. We've taught ourselves that in a lot of ways by, for example, creating economic incentives and systems that are designed to make us move all around the country to be far from family and friends, do so in such a way that, where we are pursuing careers and profit and change and things like that, but at the expense of ever being able to have any roots in a place, at the expense of ever being able to really know one another. We also do that by creating all of these pastimes and activities in groups where real intimacy isn't encouraged, where we're encouraged to sort of have a superficial connection or relationship to each other. So many of us, spend our entire lives, the people we spend a lot of our time around are coworkers, where the deepest conversation we ever have is about the weather or about some sports activity or something, something we saw in the news or the media recently. We never actually ask each other how it's going with our soul. We only just check in with each other about how it's going out there. And so I invite you to try to really invest in community. And it would be a privilege and an honor if this was that community, but whatever community it is, invest in it. Recognize that no relationship thrives without time spent. You have to spend time with each other and get to know each other, and you have to be risky and vulnerable in that relationship. You have to be willing to say what's true about yourself and let that truth be heard and reflected back to you, which can be awkward and uncomfortable. It can be frustrating because people are terrible, let's face it. What was, Sartre's famous statement? Hell is other people. And heaven is other people. Right? We need each other, even as each other sometimes is exasperating. We need each other to get through this, and in order to be able to get through it together, we're going to have to trust each other and rely on each other. We're going to have to spend time with one another past that awkward period in which all we talk about are the superficial things, and get to the time when we can talk about what's really going on and be open enough with each other that we can be a real support to one another. And the fourth and final thing that the New Testament invites us to be in touch with in order to thrive through collapse is with our soul. Now, a soul is a kind of funky, old-timey kind of concept, something that we don't necessarily spend a lot of time thinking about or talking about in our culture. What even is a soul? What makes sense in a soul? And there certainly are ideas of souls that aren't necessarily helpful for what I'm talking about. But if you just think of a soul in this instance as that part of yourself that is nourished by intangible things. By this I mean art, and I mean like truthfulness and beauty and time spent in self-reflection, time spent in active spiritual activities and ritual, hymn singing and prayers and the sacraments of communion, holy spaces and time, these sorts of things that our culture regularly now doesn't value and doesn't think are important. These things aren't there as pretty set dressing. They're there to nourish that part of ourself that needs something deeper and more intangible than can be expressed through the everyday life of simple things like, work and food and family. These are the kinds of things that go beyond merely the everyday and physical of the world and go out into that sort of realm of metaphor and mythology that really expresses something deeply true about human nature, which is that we were created in the image of God. We are somehow both these mortal fleshly beings that we are, and also something kind of beautiful and transcendent. We are the universe reflecting back upon itself. And so to get in touch with your soul, I invite you to enter into spiritual practices. If you haven't tried meditating or praying in your everyday life, try it. And if you need support to do that, I can give you some suggested tools. I can give you some prayers. I can give you some things you can do at home. If you haven't tried maybe lighting a candle or having an altar space in your home where you have some dedicated space to just reflect upon the importance of eternal things. If you haven't tried gathering together in small groups to talk about holy things, try that. You're already here, so good thing you're coming to worship, but if you are hoping to get something more out of worship, consider investing even in the things that maybe don't seem that important. Maybe for the past several weeks you haven't come and taken any communion home with you because you're like, I don't know, it's a little packet thing, it doesn't seem that important. Try taking communion every single week for a while and see if it feeds you in some way beyond the physical level, if it feeds you in some sort of spiritual way. Consider believing for a second that this ritual is real and it means what it says it means. Consider practicing art of some kind. When's the last time you wrote a piece of poetry or painted something or did something just purely for the sake of beauty and enjoying the practice? So much in our culture right now encourages us to take every aspect of our time and turn it into something productive and use it. So even if we do something beautiful, then someone will come to you and say, hey, you should open an Etsy shop or you should sell that to your friends or something. Don't do that. Don't try and make it productive. Just make something beautiful for its own sake. Try the idea of engaging in art because you believe maybe as a human being, art tells you something about what the meaning of life. It has been said that bread and work and food and these sorts of things, these are the things that we do in order to live. But poetry and art and beauty, these are the why we live. And if you're only engaging in all the things you have to do in order to live, and you're never engaging in the things that we do that are the why, the meaning of why we live, then your life might feel empty and kind of full of toil and labor and pointlessness. Because you're only doing the things you have to do to live, you're not doing the things that you're meant to do for beauty for their own sake. So seek beauty in your life. Seek some joy, seek some peace, seek some happiness. Engage in things which are frivolous, because those frivolous, joyful things are the reason that we are alive, the reason that we are here. And if you do these 4 things, if you get in touch with the land, put your hands in the soil, if you get in touch with your body, breathe deep, exercise, know the feeling of being in your skin, if you get in touch with your community, get real with each other, trust each other, share what's really going on in your lives, and if you get in touch with beauty and arts and your soul, if you get in touch with these holy things and you do these things, then it may be true that society is collapsing around you, but even in the midst of that collapse, you can thrive. We can thrive. That is, at its heart, one of the most important messages of the New Testament. Jesus says here to his disciple that the temple will be knocked down, not one stone on top of another. But he immediately goes on to say, but it will be rebuilt, referring to his own body being rebuilt in the resurrection, and thereby metaphorically referring to the community of the people of God being rebuilt through his disciples and through the church that he was founding thereafter. Jesus is saying to them that if you put your faith in temporary structures in society, you will be repeatedly disappointed. Those things will let you down. But if you put your faith in the things that God has made in this earth, in your flesh, in your community, the people who are here to support you, and in your soul and in the beauty and the art that is around you, if you put your faith in these things, you will again and again find God and God's Spirit there for you. So let us seek to thrive together. Whatever tomorrow brings, let us seek together a holy way of living that brings joy and new life. In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, all glory and honor be unto them. Amen.